Today we are pleased to host Omar Valerio-Jiménez, Associate Professor of History at University of Texas at San Antonio. He is also a Bruin, having received both his master's and doctorate degrees here at UCLA. So welcome and welcome back. He has taught courses on borderlands, Latinos, immigration, and the American West at universities in California, New York, Texas, and Iowa. And he has been involved in several research and public engagement projects to publicize Latino and Latino borderlands history and to promote Latino studies. His first book, River of Hope, Forging Identity and Nation in Rio Grande Borderlands, Duke University Press 2013, explores state formation and cultural change along the Mexico-United States border during the 18th and 19th centuries. His second book project, which you will hear about today, is a transnational study of the U.S.-Mexican War that examines memory, identity, and civil rights. He is co-editor of Major Problems in Latino History and a co-editor of the forthcoming The Latino Midwest Reader. He has published articles in journals pertaining to women's history, Mexican studies, and ethnic history, and he is a recipient of several research fellowships, including from the Western History Association and the Newberry Library. He is also on the editorial board of Etzlan, journal Chicano Studies, which is published here by the CSRC Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Valerio-Jiménez.
Okay, well thank you, Rebecca, for that nice introduction, and thank you for attending today. So my present book project focuses on the lingering influences of the U.S.-Mexican War. Now, despite the existence of monuments, place names, and commemorations of the war throughout the United States, few citizens know the causes or consequences of this forgotten war that transformed the nation into a continental power. By contrast, this conflict is prominently remembered in Mexico as having caused the loss of almost half of the nation's territory, and as an event that shaped Mexico's relations with the U.S. for decades. For Mexican Americans, the war is central to their collective memories because this traumatic event created the first generation of Mexican Americans and influenced the identity of subsequent generations. My book project addresses this paradox by comparing each nation's official histories of the war with Mexican Americans' depictions to illuminate ways in which alternative histories challenged, modified, or reinforced official portrayals. It identifies Mexican Americans' choices of remembered events, explores how memories were transmitted, and analyzes their meaning. By examining the political and social uses of memories of war in Mexico and in the United States, the book will illustrate transnational influences on the Mexican American community. Finally, my project explores the multiple ways in which the memories of war have shaped Mexican Americans' struggle for citizenship, meaning civil rights struggles. My study is the first to focus on the influence of memories of the war on Mexican Americans' campaign for civil rights. Historians of Mexico and of the U.S. have explored each nation's memories of the war and their influence on binational relations, but have generally ignored the impact on Mexican Americans. Literary scholars have analyzed the narratives authored by Mexican Americans who lived through the U.S. conquest and expressed dismay at the unfulfilled promises of U.S. citizenship. These studies have explored the development of internal community divisions, of a nascent Mexican American identity, and of alternative histories. Yet this scholarship has not considered how subsequent generations modified collective memories to suit their own struggles for citizenship rights. My project focuses on the role of collective memories in processing the trauma of war and in fomenting social transformations through political involvement or disengagement. This project will contribute to the histories of the U.S., to the history of Mexico, and memories of war. It explores questions raised by historian Michael Camlin's argument that Americans depoliticize the past in order to avoid contemporary conflicts. Which Mexican Americans adopted this strategy in order to gain acceptance into American society as equal citizens? How did memories of conquest shape contemporary struggles for civil rights? And how does the United States' historical amnesia about conquest influence its relations with descendants of the conquered and with Mexico. Popular memories and national histories of war affect international relations and also shape how each nation's populations view citizens of other countries. There is a stark difference, for example, in the way that the US and Mexico remember and forget the war. For example, in the US, Americans refer to the conflict as the Mexican-American War, sometimes even the Mexican War, and usually, as I like to term it, the US-Mexican War. While Mexicans in Mexico identify the conflict as the War of North American Aggression, or sometimes the War of North American Intervention. Mexican Americans who lived through the war also had different interpretations of the conflict. Such disagreements within and among official, group, and individual memories are the subject of scholar Viet Thanh Nguyen's cogent observation. All wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. By exploring the ways that both nations and their citizens use memories, this study illuminates the strategic, political, and social uses of memories of war, not just for the Mexican and US cases, but also for community and national histories more generally. So my project addresses three critical topics in memory studies. First, the relationship among memories within a community. The second, the reception and transmission of memories. And third, the connections between the social and political issues. In tracing collective memory, over time, my study addresses the politics of memory by examining how succeeding generations reinforced or modified earlier memories of conquest according to their contemporary and social political context. While some studies of collective memories usually assume that a common identity unites a social group, my project acknowledges the inter-community divisions that determine which events are remembered and shape the reception of these memories. Rather than presuming a singular collective memory, my study examines various remembrances among a diverse Mexican-American community. Now, I want to say one thing that I'm using Mexican-American because I'm looking at sort of the Mexican-American community over time in the 19th century and the 20th century. And I know that in some cases, the individuals that I'm speaking about didn't necessarily use that term to self-identify, but I'm using it as an umbrella term. I know sometimes, for example, one of the last examples I'm going to give about the brown berets, they're going to use Chicano, and others are going to use Spanish American and Hispanic American and so forth. Okay, so my current project is called Remembering Conquest. This explores the trauma of war as expressed in the collective memories of several generations from the 19th into the 20th century. It begins by examining how a victorious nation incorporated a losing nation's citizens and analyzes the changes in Mexican Americans' collective memories and in national histories over time. This is what occurred when some 100,000 former Mexican citizens living in the ceded territory, what is today the US Southwest, from Texas through New Mexico all the way to California, when they became American citizens after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the US-Mexican War. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the first Mexican Americans did not have a uniform memory of the war or of their subsequent dispossession. They responded to their political and economic displacement by European Americans in various ways. Some accommodated by aligning themselves politically and by intermarrying with the newcomers. Others retreated into urban or rural enclaves, and a few launched rebellions. They suffered political, economic, and social losses as European Americans displaced them from power, and as the war's outcome ruptured their national ties to Mexico. Among the rebellions were several in California and in Texas and New Mexico, which cited as motivation not only the US-Mexican War, but also the nation's unwillingness to enforce the promises of citizenship for Mexican Americans. Other Mexican Americans also wrote about US annexation, often lamenting the unfulfilled promises of citizenship. These narratives include individual and family stories, as well as accounts of the Mexican American community's adaptation to American rule. Others remembered an idyllic Mexican period, while ignoring class, ethnic, and gender divisions within their communities, as well as Mexicans' conquest of American Indians. I argued that from the first generation until the present, Mexican Americans have selectively remembered the multiple conquests in the US-Mexico borderlands. Scholarship in memory studies often makes the argument that the process of selectively remembering also involves actively forgetting. The first generation of Mexican Americans conveniently forgot their and their ancestors' role in conquering and subjugating Indians when they issued sharp critiques of the US conquest of Mexico's far north. Subsequent generations would continue to downplay the atrocities committed against Native peoples on behalf of the Spanish Empire to build a Mexican state and to establish territorial borders. My first book and my current project have several themes in common, and this is my first book. The US-Mexican War is a pivotal event in the River of Hope. Its outcome ushered in the second conquest of the region, US annexation and the changing jurisdiction that would bring about multiple changes. The war began in South Texas. This is a drawing of US troops along or in the present-day Corpus Christi area. The war began in the South Texas region, and in particular it began in Palo Alto, which is, I think I have my little, which is right here, right there. So this is, Matamoros is the Mexican border city at the sort of the mouth of the Rio Grande, and on the opposite side, the twin city is Brownsville, and that's where it began in Palo Alto. And then this is just a better version of that. There's Palo Alto, there's Matamoros, and then this is just for context. This is Padre Island, or South Padre Island. One of the first battles was the Battle of Palo Alto. In River of Hope, I demonstrated that the concerns over citizenship rights, criminalization, and education were present among Mexican Texans or among Tejanos in the 19th century. In my new project, I argue that the civil rights movement of the 20th century had 19th century origins, and that the promises of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo are often referenced in civil rights struggles of subsequent generations. River of Hope examined residents' views of changes in citizenship and national identity, while Remembering Conquest, my present project, seeks to link the history and memory of the war with Mexican American struggles to claim citizenship rights. Transnational influences are another common theme. In River of Hope, I examine transnational connections between Mexican nationals, meaning Mexican citizens, and Mexican Americans that began in the 19th century and continue today. Remembering Conquest will follow these transnational links to explore how Mexican immigrants' perception of the war shaped their views of the US and in turn influenced Mexican Americans' collective memories. So Mexico's education system teaches Mexican nationals or Mexican citizens a much different view of the US-Mexican War than what the US education system has traditionally taught Mexican Americans. In my research, the transnational influences on collective war memories became apparent when Mexican nationals migrated to the US and disagreed with Mexican Americans about the war, or when Mexican Americans visit relatives in Mexico and discuss the war. Ultimately, the US-Mexico border has been and continues to be permeable, not only to people and goods, but also to ideas and views of history. So among the first generation of Mexican Americans were these two individuals, Juan Cortina and Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, who each chose very different ways of expressing their discontent with the US conquest, but who both used memories of conquest and of the war to advance civil rights. Compared to their contemporaries, both left extensive documentation because they were wealthy, socially and politically connected, and in the case of Ruiz de Burton, highly literate. I would like to add a brief note on terminology. I'm using the term Mexican Americans to identify 19th century ethnic Mexican residents of the Southwest who were US citizens, who had a US citizenship. I understand, as I mentioned earlier, that these residents often identified primarily as Tejanos, as Californios, as Nuevo Mexicanos, or simply as Mexicanos. So I use Mexican Americans knowing that they did not use this term in the 19th century. To differentiate between ethnic Mexicans, citizens of the US, meaning Mexican Americans, and citizens of Mexico, I use the term Mexican national to refer to Mexican citizens. Okay, so Juan Cortina on your left there was a descendant of 18th century military colonist who established the Villas del Norte, and his mother was the owner of this land grant right here, which is where the current town of Brownsville is situated. It's a huge land grant in present-day Cameron County, Texas. He is remembered for leading a 6-month rebellion in South Texas that began when he shot an Anglo-American Brownsville marshal who was pistol whipping a drunken Mexican worker. Cortina's forces, an estimated 350 to 600 men, gained popularity by defeating local and state militias. A combined force of Texas Rangers and Federal Army troops eventually suppressed the rebellion, but not before the conflict caused widespread devastation and the abandonment of many ranches from Brownsville to Rio Grande City. So many of these ranches here were abandoned along the river as a result of the rebellion. During the rebellion, the Cortinistas, which were the rebels, that's what they were referred to, issued several pronunciamientos or proclamations to explain their motivations. Printed in Spanish and in English and circulated on both sides of the border, they contained an incisive critique of U.S. annexation. These proclamations would serve to publicize memories of conquest among Cortina's contemporaries and for future generations. They are also examples of the social and political uses of collective memories. Among the proclamation's grievances were the devastating property losses of elite Tejanos, including Cortina's family, and the criminalization and legal persecution of the poor. The proclamation specifically accused lawyers, judges, and law enforcement officers of cooperating to deprive Tejanos of property rights and equal protection under the law. One of the rebels' first actions when they took over the town of Brownsville, was to free prisoners, because the insurgents correctly believed that the biases of the local juries led to the increasing imprisonment and disproportionate imprisonment of Mexican Texans in municipal jails and in the state penitentiary. Tracing this unjust treatment to U.S. annexation, the rebels accused the U.S. of failing to uphold Tejano citizenship rights. The rebellion gave the Cortinistas an opportunity to describe their dashed expectations of U.S. citizenship. They argued that Mexican nationals, meaning Mexican immigrants, had chosen to live in the U.S. after witnessing Mexico's political turmoil, and because, as they wrote, since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they, meaning Mexican nationals, have been attracted to its soil, the U.S., by the soft influence of wise laws and the advantages of free government, end quote. These expectations, however, were not fulfilled. Summarizing their disappointment, the Cortinistas claimed that the promises offered by U.S. citizenship were in reality, quote unquote, the baseless fabric of a dream. Like Cortina, I'm going to go back here. Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton's literary contributions demonstrate a strategic use of memories of conquest, as well as transnational influences. Born in Baja California in 1833, she received her education from a private tutor from Spain. Her grandfather, a lieutenant in the Spanish colonial army, became governor of Baja California in 1822, and her great-uncle was in charge of the Presidio at San Diego. Both men received very large land grants for their service in the army. In 1848, Maria Amparo Ruiz and her family moved from Baja California to Monterey, California, in present-day Northern California. The following year, she married Henry Burton, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, a native of Connecticut and a West Point graduate. While living in Monterey, she developed a long-standing friendship with Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, a wealthy Californian rancher, politician, and military officer. For the rest of her life, she exchanged many letters with Vallejo and with his family. In an 1859 letter, for example, to Vallejo's son, his name was Platon, Ruiz de Burton expressed her view of the unfulfilled promises of U.S. citizenship. Quote, "It cannot be denied that the Californios have reason to complain. The Americans must feel it. Their boasted liberty and equality of rights seems to stop when it meets a Californian. They can crush us with impunity, they know it, and broke their faith so solemnly pledged at Guadalupe Hidalgo. How shameful this in the conquering the prosperous, the mighty nation. End quote. Lieutenant Burton, her husband, was subsequently transferred to San Diego, where the Burtons homesteaded Rancho Hamul after U.S. courts rejected its original owner's property title. So in 1859, right around the time that Juan Cortina was launching his rebellion, after another military transfer, the Burtons moved to the East Coast, where Arista Burton socialized with several military and political elites, including President Abraham Lincoln. Upon Lieutenant Burton's death in 1869, Arista Burton returned to San Diego and developed extensive ranch industries. She eventually received title to Rancho Hamul, but lost all the land during the 1880s to 160 squatters and creditors. For several years afterwards, Arista Burton pursued lawsuits in local, state, and federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. And she traveled to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress on behalf of California landowners. This background helps explain her literary productions. So here we go. In 1872, she published her first novel, which is this one here, Who Would Have Thought It? This novel examines race and class during the U.S. Civil War, and it has the distinction of being the first published English language novel by a Mexican-American author. She wrote her second novel on the right, The Squatter and the Dawn, in the 1890s, and this is the novel that I'm particularly interested in. In her second novel, a group of Californios appealed to President Ulysses S. Grant to intervene in a land case in which a Californian family is pitted against a group of squatters. I believe that Arista Burton employed this type of, quote, disguised autobiographical fiction, end quote, because this genre of writing offers a safer space than memoir for some ethnic minority writers to offer a counter-narrative about the past. As historian Hannah Ewens has observed, memory fiction can serve to represent, quote, not only the author's memories, but a spectrum of memories for a whole community, end quote. So The Squatter and the Dawn, I argue, represents Arista Burton's memory and a spectrum of memories of the California elite. The novel then serves to disseminate collective memories of conquest that countered the traditional triumphalist narrative of U.S. westward expansion. While the novel generally ignores the experiences of poor Californians and of Indians, Arista Burton does identify the Anglo-American squatters' racial prejudice as an important part of her critique of U.S. territorial conquest. She also criticizes the widespread corruption in the U.S. government, especially the alliance between railroad companies and local officials that we're all familiar with in California history. The Cortina Rebellion and Arista Burton's literary contributions demonstrate the ways that some Mexican Americans deployed memories of conquest to press for civil rights. Both are exemplary of the first generation to live under U.S. rule, who was also the first group of Mexican Americans to ask the United States to live up to its ideals and promises. This generation elected municipal and state representatives, they filed lawsuits in pursuit of justice, and issued civil rights appeals to state and federal officials. Yet the lives of Cortina and Arista Burton were full of contradictions. Both portrayed Mexicans as victims of U.S. conquest, but they neglected to discuss Mexicans' roles as conquerors of indigenous nations. Cortina, for example, was also very critical of U.S. annexation, and in particular of the second-class citizenship of Tejanos. Yet he remained silent on the injustices that his ancestors had inflicted on indigenous people, and on his own role in exterminating a band of Karankawa Indians. Likewise, Arista Burton's writings exemplify Mexican Americans' collective memories of land loss and of their inability to obtain justice within the U.S. legal system. Her choice to forget her grandfather and granduncle's role in the conquest of indigenous nations in Baja and Alta California would also be repeated by subsequent generations, who held the U.S. accountable for the violent conquest of Mexicans, while absolving their Spanish and Mexican ancestors for their violent conquest of Native Americans. Similarly, Ruiz de Burton was critical of U.S. westward expansion, yet she married a military officer who participated in this expansion. Finally, both Cortina and Ruiz de Burton are early examples of Mexican Americans with transnational family connections, who employed collective memories of war to advance civil rights. Their proclamations, letters, and novels would also reinforce the collective memories of future generations. Now I'm going to skip over to the 20th century. The war's trauma reverberated among succeeding generations by influencing their identity and political activism. It would shape Mexican Americans' views of their place within the U.S., as well as their relationship to Mexico. In the early 20th century, Mexican Americans faced increasing job competition from the influx of Mexican immigrants fleeing the Mexican Revolution, as well as from intense social and economic pressures resulting from World War I and the Great Depression. These developments coincided with the increasing segregation of Mexicans throughout the American West. In the context of these tensions, a transformation occurred in popular historical memory. Even as Mexican Americans were experiencing increasing residential segregation, American tourism officials began promoting missions and forts as monuments to the quote-unquote Spanish past. By creating a more palatable Spanish colonial past, dominant groups constructed a Spanish fantasy heritage in order to whitewash the American West's connection to Mexico and Mexican culture. And here I'm borrowing from the works of Carey McWilliams and Bill Deverell. In the early 20th century, the U.S. public viewed Mexican Americans as racially mixed people who were non-white and had an inferior culture. Facing demographic pressures and segregation, Mexican Americans had to navigate within these new parameters in which identification with an ethnic Mexican past might result in additional disenfranchisement. Now, contemporary and regional concerns shaped Mexicans' reaction to these pressures. To distance themselves from poor Mexican immigrants with a racially mixed heritage, some Mexican Americans portrayed their own ancestors as racially pure Spaniards. Others rejected this constructed past, instead remembering the conquest that their Mexican forebears had experienced. As historian Lisbeth Haas has shown, the what she calls monumentalization of the Spanish past carried different meanings for European American tourism boosters, for the Catholic Church, for Mexican Americans, and for American Indians. Each population's interpretation of such monuments demonstrates not only distinctive viewpoints, but also different uses of memory. In 1833, for example, Mexican Americans in San Juan Capistrano, and this is just a map of that city, decided to honor, successfully petitioned, to change the name of San Juan Capistrano street names to honor Spanish-Mexican families. This petition simultaneously inscribed their collective memories onto the town's landscape and asserted their claims to citizenship, both local and national. But it also minimized the role of Indians and the fact that this had been a native site. Mexican Americans in New Mexico had different motivations to appeal to a Spanish fantasy heritage. In the early 20th century, New Mexico remained a territory because the U.S. Congress resisted its repeated petitions for statehood due to the territory's large Mexican American and Indian populations, which were considered non-white. So Nuevo Mexicanos claimed a Spanish heritage in an effort to persuade federal officials that the majority of their territory's population was white, and thus that the territory was eligible for statehood. According to historian John Nieto Phillips, this constructed Spanish-American identity was partly oppositional, as they sought to counter European Americans' negative depictions of Mexican Americans. Now, several generations throughout the 19th and 20th century have used the memories of the U.S.-Mexican War in multiple ways and for varied political ends. Some in an attempt at reconciliation and others in struggles for civil rights. While state heritage societies, including those in California, often excluded racial and ethnic minorities in the early 20th century, they allowed Mexican Americans with ties to so-called Spanish ancestors to become members. By joining such organizations, Sameli Californios, Nuevo Mexicanos, and Tejanos helped establish monuments, parks, and commemorations for the US-Mexican War. In the 1890s, for example, Adina de Zavala led efforts to restore the Alamo, the famous mission in San Antonio, and convert it into a public landmark in order to honor the memory of Mexican Texans like her grandfather, who participated in Texas' struggle for independence. His name was Lorenzo de Zavala. While the Battle of the Alamo occurred before the US-Mexican War, the memory of the battle was used to generate enthusiasm for the war. According to anthropologist Richard Flores, de Zavala lost control over the restoration and management of the Alamo, and it subsequently became a power symbol of anti-Mexican sentiment. Yet de Zavala's efforts to highlight Tejano's role in Texas history is remarkable, as is her use of collective memories to establish a historical society, to teach, and to write books. In her letters, written in the 1940s, she acknowledges the devastating effects of U.S. conquest on Mexican Texans. Most importantly for my project, she identified several civil rights issues, for example, land loss, poor educational opportunities, and the denial of citizenship rights, as problems confronting Tejanos. She argued that these issues were the result of the dominant population's views of Tejanos and of the lack of government enforcement of laws. As Richard Flores has written, de Zavala was very interested in preserving and restoring the Spanish and Mexican roots of Texas, and in the process of writing Mexicans back into the state's early history, or in owning history. The correspondence among de Zavala, historian Carlos Castañeda, folklorist and historian Jovita González de Mireles, teacher and historian Elena Zamora Ochea, and even San Antonio Mayor Maury Maverick, demonstrates that some scholars and activists in the early 20th century held collective memories of the war that motivated their struggles for civil rights, including the inclusion or the attempt to include Mexican Americans in the state's history, in Texas history. Flores reminds us that contemporary events influence de Zavala and other historical actors, so we must understand that their contemporary historical context to make sense of their actions. In New Mexico, for example, the territory's struggle to obtain statehood shaped politics and influenced Hispanos' views. So throughout the 18th and 19th century, statehood sort of hung over many of the political actions that Nuevo Mexicanos took. In the 1910s, Nuevo Mexicano Benjamin Maurice Reed wrote Guerra Mexico-Americana, in which he reinterpreted the US-Mexican War as a conflict caused by European Americans' long-standing racial hostility towards Spanish Americans, and that was his term that he used to refer to Mexican Americans in New Mexico. Writing in Spanish, Reed sought to correct historical inaccuracies, denounce Anglo-American prejudices, and encouraged Nuevo Mexicanos to take pride in their past. Reed's scholarship did not lead Nuevo Mexicanos to remember their ties to Mexico, but rather to emphasize their constructed Spanish heritage. By claiming whiteness, Hispanos were also advancing their political agenda for statehood, which Congress denied for years, because congressmen continued to perceive the majority of New Mexico's residents as non-white. According to historian Neto Phillips, Reed's work helped give Nuevo Mexicanos pride in their Spanish blood, so-called Spanish blood, and history. Now, 2 decades later, a civil rights group in Texas also remembered the war, but their goals differed significantly from those of previous generations. During the late 1920s, the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, restricted their membership to U.S. citizens in an attempt to avoid the racial animosity directed against Mexican immigrants, whose lack of U.S. citizenship was seen as a major barrier to unity. This goal led middle-class LULAC members to distance themselves from immigrants and from Mexico, and thereby attempt to separate themselves from negative characterizations directed against immigrants. As political scientist Benjamin Marquez and historian Cynthia Orozco have shown, LULAC activists chose this strategy to further their claim of being, quote, 100% American, and this is one of the phrases that they would use, in an attempt to reap the full benefits of U.S. citizenship. Yet LULAC's political goals cannot be viewed as exclusively assimilationist. In an editorial entitled Our Texas Mexicans Americans that appeared in the LULAC News, Jose P. Canales portrayed Texas Mexicans as the original white settlers of Texas, while casting Anglo-Americans, colonists, as foreigners. Now, just a side note, Jose P. Canales was a descendant of Juan Cortina. Some scholars have criticized Canales and other LULAC members for claiming whiteness and downplaying Mexicans' indigenous roots. But it is important to understand the political environment in which LULAC was operating in the 1930s. They claimed whiteness because they wanted to exercise U.S. citizenship rights. LULAC members knew that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had guaranteed Mexican Americans all the rights of U.S. citizens. And legally, at least in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, white Americans were the only group who could exercise those rights. So Mexican Americans were, by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, legally equated with white Americans, at least on paper. Canales' editorial describes the guarantees promised by the treaty and acknowledges that these promises had not been kept. It then directly links Tejano's second-class citizenship with several civil rights issues facing them, including the denial of suffrage, non-representative jury service, the lack of Mexican Texan elected officials, segregated schools, and their limited use of public places. The editorial also corrected the current version of early Texas history by identifying Tejanos as participants and survivors of the Battle of the Alamo and as signers of the state's Declaration of Independence. Like Adina de Zavala, Canales wrote Tejanos back into Texas history in order to advocate for civil rights and to establish in his conclusion that, quote, Texas Mexicans are emphatically real Americans, end quote. During the same period, a young Tejana was completing a history thesis that would have a significant impact on future scholarship. One of the most prominent contributors to Tejano history and to the preservation of Mexican Texans' collective memories was Jovita Gonzalez. Born in Roma, Texas, along the border, and a descendant of a land-grant family, Gonzalez grew up in Roma and in San Antonio, where she received her BA from Our Lady of the Lake University. In 1930, she earned a master's degree at UT Austin after writing a groundbreaking history thesis under the supervision of Eugene Barker. Her thesis became one of the most widely consulted unpublished sources of historical information and influenced a generation of scholars, including Americo Paredes, David Montejano, and many others, including myself. In her thesis, Gonzalez offered what literary scholar Maria Cuotera has labeled a counter-history to the grand narratives of Texas developed by her advisor, Eugene Barker, by her mentor, J. Frank Dobie, and Walter Prescott Webb. In her thesis introduction, Gonzalez reminded readers that Mexicans had been in the region before Texas became a state, that Anglo-Americans were the real immigrant newcomers to Texas, and that many Mexican Texans were not immigrants but rather descendants of land-grant heirs, just like she was. Unlike Americo Paredes, however, who would subsequently idealize Mexican-American border society, Gonzalez described a community sharply divided by class, race, and gender. Her perspective was truly groundbreaking in 1930. To describe ranch life in the colonial period, Gonzalez drew on her family's collective memories because her primary sources did not contain these details. Using court records, wills, and municipal documents, my own analysis in River of Hope of indebted labor in the Villas del Norte agreed with Gonzalez's view. Grounded in historical documents, her thesis used collective memories to fill in the gaps of her sources. Well ahead of her time, she used the method that historian Randolph Campbell advocated in a recent anthology. While discussing the tensions between history and memory, Campbell urged historians to write histories that use individual memories as sources and to take fully into account the power of collective memories and make those memories themselves a means of understanding Texas's past. Jovita Gonzalez continues to have an impact on Mexican Americans' collective memories, most recently with the posthumous publication of two books, Dew on the Thorn, which is a folklore study, and Caballero, a co-authored novel. Unpublished during her lifetime, Both manuscripts were recovered and published in the 1990s by Arte Público Press. Co-authored with Margaret Eimer, Caballero focuses on one family's reaction to the jurisdictional changes resulting from the US-Mexican War. The family lives in Matamoros and owns a ranch in the present-day Lower Rio Grande Valley. Gonzalez and Eimer criticize US westward expansion and the losses experienced by Mexican families. The novel also offers a feminist critique of Mexican patriarchal family structure of the mid-19th century. While various literary scholars, including José Limón, Leticia Garza Falcón, John Moran Gonzalez, and Maria Cotera, have analyzed the novel's narrative structure, the co-authorship, the views of race and class, my interest is in examining the novel as an expression of Mexican Americans' collective memories, through its discussion of devastating property losses, the imposition of the US racial order, and military conquest. Yet the novel also provides a positive view of the new opportunities that the US offered indebted workers, women, and gay men, as a result of the change in jurisdiction. In Caballero, the internal divisions of Mexican border society are evident in its characters' differing reaction to the arrival of Americans. Some strongly oppose the newcomers and their government, while others welcome them. This portrayal of divided community reaction is strongly informed by Tejano's collective memories, of which Gonzalez was cognizant and of which her primary sources were silent. By using government records, court records, and government documents, court records, and newspapers, I discussed this divided community reaction in my book, A River of Hope, as evidence of deep class and gender divisions that resulted in indebted laborers from Mexico fleeing into the U.S. for higher wages, and in Mexican and Mexican American women securing divorces in U.S. courts, which were unavailable in Mexico at the time. In addition to drawing on collective memories for her novels and academic writings, Gonzalez alluded to these memories in her correspondence with various Mexican American scholars, including historian Carlos Castañeda and educator George I. Sanchez, as she contributed to the efforts to recover and incorporate Tejano history into the general Texas history. Okay. During the 1950s, another civil rights group would adopt a very different strategy than LULAC in deploying memories of conquest, or memories of the US-Mexican War. Created through the effort of the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, the Asociación Nacional Mexicoamericana, or ANMA, believed that the Mexican people are objects of an accelerated program of discrimination, deportations, physical assault, police brutality, and at times murder. When Mexican Americans came under increasing attacks during the 1950s, ANMA countered by encouraging Mexican Americans to take pride in their culture and to rediscover their roots in the U.S. Southwest and in Mexico. The organization nurtured ties with Mexico and promoted cultural nationalism, but it also promoted awareness of international connections to Latin America. ANMA emphasized the role of the US-Mexican War in creating what they called a forgotten people, referring to Mexican Americans who became an underclass of American citizens. ANMA believed, quote, Mexican American history had commenced in violence, conquest, and the subjugation of the resident Mexican population, end quote. These views and ANMA's working class roots shaped its political ideology, as it sought to include both undocumented workers and Mexican Americans as members. So ANMA was very different than LULAC and than many previous organizations because it basically organized regardless of citizenship. These examples demonstrate how activists selectively deploy collective memories to advance strategic political goals. Okay. The social and political context in Mexico and the US had a direct influence on the political activism of Mexican Americans and the construction of their ethnic identities. Since the mid-19th century, the Mexican government has advocated on behalf of Mexican nationals living as immigrants in the US. Typical cases involved Mexican immigrants who needed assistance with legal problems, labor disputes, or immigration issues. Because Mexican Americans often worked and lived alongside Mexican Americans, the Mexican government frequently advocated on behalf of its citizens as well as on behalf of Mexican Americans who confronted very similar problems. In these instances, Mexican officials were usually very critical of the failure of the U.S. government to respect the rights of Mexican Americans, and of various state and national efforts to disenfranchise and racially categorize Mexican Americans as non-white. The Mexican government's involvement occasionally addressed rights guaranteed to Mexican Americans by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and thus invoked the memories of war. By analyzing the Mexican government's engagement in the civil rights and labor struggles of Mexican Americans, my project explores transnational influences on their political and economic campaigns. It also illustrates how the involvement of Mexico's government could assist and hinder, in some cases, Mexican Americans' activism. Now I'm going to close with the last example. Throughout the 20th century, civil rights activists identified Mexican Americans' poverty, isolation, segregation, and political exclusion as lingering effects of the U.S.-Mexican War. In the 1970s, for example, elite Mexican Americans in Brownsville, Texas, took part in a successful campaign to create national landmarks at U.S.-Mexican battle sites. So they helped establish the Palo Alto National Park near Brownsville, just north of Brownsville. Part of their goal was to use these landmarks as a way to heal racial and ethnic rifts in the community. And indeed, they obtained diverse local community backing as well as support from Mexico's official. During the same period, however, Chicano activists sought to use the memories of war to fight for civil rights. In a march that began in California and extended throughout the U.S. Southwest, meant to raise awareness of Mexican Americans' poor living conditions and political disenfranchisement, the Brown Berets often invoke the war and its aftermath. While visiting U.S.-Mexican war landmarks, the Brown Berets often attempted to raise the Mexican flag, and you can see them here marching with the Mexican flag and here as well, as a reminder of Mexico's former claim to the land. And they also created alternative monuments to Mexican Americans who fought on Mexico's behalf. And this is one of the alternative monuments that they created. This is in outside of Brownsville, Texas. And it says, Dedicado para Juan Cortina, who fought for justice for Mexicans who lived in the U.S. in 1859. Now, while traveling through Tucson, Arizona, the Brown Berets took over a public park and they renamed it Joaquin Murrieta Park. They also dedicated a monument to his honor. At the rally dedicating the monument, one of the speakers referred to the collective memories of Murrieta as evidence of Mexican Americans' resistance to U.S. westward expansion. Referring to Murrieta, the speaker said, quote, "On this day, let it be known that we are the first to build a monument for a great Chicano hero, for a man who stole from the rich to give to the poor. Today, this serves as a reminder that the West was not wild until the expansion of the United States boundaries," end quote. Along their expedition through Aswan, which is the title of David Sanchez's memoir about the march, they met local residents who shared their collective memories of Mexican Americans' past. In Brownsville, Texas, for example, they met Teresa Canales, who was a relative of Juan Cortina. After learning from Canales of her family's collective memories, the Brown Berets decided to dedicate a monument to Cortina. And let me just say that they would set up these monuments, and then the local governments would quickly basically remove them after the Brown Berets had left. Ultimately, these and other Chicano activists combined collective memories of the war with myths to construct a view of the U.S. Southwest as a Chicano homeland, and to promote entitlement among Mexican Americans who had been politically and socially marginalized. The construction and dedication of monuments to Mexican American rebels like Murrieta and Cortina demonstrate the Brown Berets' attempt to create counter-narratives to the nation's public history, which ignored both Murrieta and Cortina, and to propagate collective memories of these rebels as champions of civil rights activism. My project's significance centers on the studies of memories of war as motivation for social change. I chose to focus on the U.S.-Mexican War because it is a foundational event in Latino history. The war's conclusion and the subsequent signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 incorporated the first group of Latinos into the U.S., meaning Mexican Americans. While this treaty specified civil and property rights for Mexican Americans, in practice, local communities throughout the U.S. Southwest did not respect these rights. My study demonstrates that several generations of Mexican Americans would recall that treaty and its promises, and appeal to the collective memories of war in various struggles for full citizenship rights. The experience of Mexican Americans to claim citizenship through their deployment of collective memories of war is a useful example for understanding how ethnic minorities are incorporated into nations as a result of wars. For the U.S., this process repeated itself 50 years after the U.S.-Mexican War. Puerto Ricans became the second group of Latinos to become part of the U.S., also forcibly. In their case, as a result of the Spanish-American War of 1898. While Puerto Ricans were not granted U.S. citizenship until 1917 with the Jones Act, they faced similar struggles to those of Mexican Americans. As ethnic minorities, Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans became part of a nation that limited their rights and their self-determination. While the history of the incorporation of Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans into the U.S. is quite distinct, both groups have also remained linked by parallel struggles for greater political empowerment through self-government. Both groups have also experienced a racialization process in the U.S. that placed them in the legal and social edges of whiteness and citizenship. My project has potential implications for wars in other parts of the world. Ethnic minorities are often incorporated into a victorious nation society at the conclusion of war. While minority populations are not necessarily promised citizenship, they inevitably begin to agitate for an expansion of their rights within their new nation. While my project cannot address these comparisons at length, it does offer a case study of the experiences of one minority population and examines salient questions for cases elsewhere. For example, how might ethnic minorities use memories of war to press for civil and/or human rights? Which strategies of invoking collective memories of trauma have been successful? What has limited their success? And how do political and social contexts influence struggles for social change? These are questions that I hope my current book project will answer. Thank you very much, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Any questions? Don't be shy. Yes, Rebecca.
I'm interested in your research methods for this and the
Sure.
variety of histories you're telling, and to what have you pulled from primary sources and what are you retelling from others?
Sure.
And all?
So the 19th century material is from primary sources that I found myself, partly the stuff, especially the material from Texas. Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton's novel they're published. They've been reissued recently, and so as a historian, I can use it as a primary source, in terms of as a novel, as one historian has called memory fiction, right? As not quite a memoir, but a memoir or a novel based on sort of like what it would be today would be called historical fiction, right? That's what she's doing. And then for the material for different groups like LULAC and LULAC activists and ANMA, I've actually been able to obtain primary sources, their newsletters, their letters. There's a huge collection of letters from LULAC and their newsletters and writings at the Benson Latin American Collection at UT Austin. And then recently, in the last, I guess, 2 years maybe, the Chicano Studies Research Library here at UCLA has acquired the archives of two of the co-founders of the Brown Berets, Rosalía Muñoz and David Sanchez. And so I'm using his memoir, which is published, but I've also looked at, David Sanchez was interviewed for the oral history collection at UCLA, and that's online, so I've used that. And then I plan to come back in June to look at the actual documents that are in those two collections. So it's a variety. I mean, mainly using primary sources that I found in different archives, and then published primary sources like novels and newsletters and newspapers. So one of the great things about sort of doing this research now as opposed to when I was in grad school is that a lot of stuff is online now. And so I tell my graduate students, you don't really know how easy you have it or how hard we had it, because we had to look at microfilm and we still have to look at microfilm, but it's a lot easier, because a lot of materials available, and it's also searchable. So I mean, you know, the oral history collection, it's transcribed. I mean, that interview, I don't even have to listen to it, I can just, you know, read it. So those are some of the things, and you know, I'm not looking at this, some of the novels, for example, I'm not using the same kind of methodology that a literary scholar would. I'm looking at it sort of from a historian's perspective, to look at, you know, how and when these authors reference the U.S.-Mexican War, and then what they say about it. Another set of sort of you could say interviews, perhaps, are the California testimonios that Bancroft collected, Bancroft and his staff, that Rosario Sanchez has analyzed in Telling Identities, and some of those are published, some of those are available on microfilm, basically. So I've used those as well. Yes.
Yeah. So who fired the first shot?
For the U.S.-Mexican War?
Yeah.
Well, so it's one of those instances where, you know, the war, it's really interesting. When I explain the war in my classes, I tell students that, you know, when you go back to this map here, let's see here, there, oops, there. So, you know, the Republic of Texas, right, that was existed for 9 years, from 1836 to 1845, it's just that yellow area there, the dark yellow area. And so this area here that's crosshatched, you know, white and yellow stripes, was sort of disputed territory. And even the Texas Republic was disputed territory, because the Mexican government tried to recapture it several times during its 9-year existence. But anyway, this territory here was disputed, and so Texas claimed jurisdiction over it, but it didn't really have any jurisdiction, because all the people who had ranches here, they all lived in the town. They had ranch houses, but they also, if they lived in town, they lived along the Vías del Norte, which were all along the river. And those, you know, that's what my first book was about. During this whole period of the Texas Republic, they were reporting to Mexico. They weren't reporting to Texas. And so when the U.S. troops are sent to Corpus Christi, they were sent right here, and technically they're still in Texas. But as soon as they cross the Nueces River, they're in disputed territory. They're in Mexican territory. And so they come over here to Palo Alto, and basically because they're there, the Mexican military goes and tells them to leave, and they don't leave. And when they don't leave, then there's a skirmish where U.S. soldiers die, as well as Mexican soldiers. And that event, when that skirmish, is the sort of excuse that Polk uses to claim that U.S. blood had been shed on U.S. soil incorrectly, because it wasn't U.S. soil. And you know, people, all sorts of politicians in the 1840s dispute Polk's assertion, including Abraham Lincoln. And so Abraham Lincoln, for instance, issues the so-called spot resolutions, in which he asked President Polk, "I want you to show me on a map where this blood had been shed to prove that it wasn't U.S. soil, because it wasn't. It was Mexican soil."
Who asked for that?
Lincoln. Or Abraham Lincoln, when he was a senator.
The Polk's diaries are clear that he would go to war to get California.
Yeah, and also, I mean, so Grant, Ulysses S. Grant was a general in the war, right, before he became president. And in his memoirs, he says, we were sent into disputed territory, but it was essential that Mexico fire its first shot, so that we could then say that they had invaded U.S. territory and shot soldiers. And so, you know, this is a very common sort of tactic that nations use.
Yeah.
You know, Gulf of Tonkin is the same whole thing. You know, same thing. So they provoke, you know, a response, and then they use it to declare war. So that's what happened there.
So who fired the first shot?
Well, I guess figuratively it would be the U.S. because it provoked, you know, it entered territory where, you know, that wasn't its territory. It entered with armed military, entered into Mexican territory. So that's what I would say.
Okay, and there were also ships off the coast of Veracruz.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they wanted. So Polk tried two strategies. He tried a diplomatic strategy to buy the land, and when that didn't work, because Mexico refused, they said we don't want to sell the land. He then tried a military strategy, which is what worked. So right, and so and the war led to a lot of atrocities when the military was in northern Mexico. And one of the things that I discuss in my classes is that so the U.S. Army during the U.S.-Mexican War was composed of both sort of trained military personnel that were trained in U.S. West Point and were career soldiers, and also many volunteers. And the volunteers are the ones that they had the most trouble with. And Grant and other military officers say, we're having real bad problems because these volunteers, when they're waiting for instruction, they were waiting along the river, these towns along the river here, the border towns, today would be border towns. They start committing atrocities against the civilian population. And they start, for instance, going into Catholic churches and desecrating them. They disrespect, priests, and that's what leads to another sort of big development that at least students are really interested in, which is there's a group of soldiers, U.S. soldiers, who defect from the U.S. troops, which are the San Patricio Battalion, Irish and German immigrants, and German Americans and Irish Americans, who feel that so at this time in the mid-19th century, there's also a lot of anti-Catholicism directed against Irish immigrants, because there's a large Irish immigration right into the U.S. because of the Irish potato famine. So the U.S. military, U.S. soldiers are part of U.S. society, and so they have the same kind of anti-Catholicism within their ranks, these views, and they direct it against their own, Irish soldiers or Catholic soldiers, and they direct it against the Mexican population. So it's a really interesting, event, and one of the things that I've learned, in studying the U.S.-Mexican War is that both the Mexican government and the Irish government continue to have sort of commemorate the actions of the San Patricio Battalion, and they continue to have, I don't know if it's every year or but sort of regular commemorations of this participation, that the San Patricio sort of went over to the Mexican side and tried to defend Mexico during the war.
And where is that, here or over there?
It happens in both places. It happens in Ireland, it happens in Mexico. Yeah. So, and one of the things that I didn't mention, and I sort of mentioned briefly in my talk, was that that how the war is remembered in Mexico, how it's remembered in the U.S. right, very differently. Even the names of it, right. Well, I was born in Matamoros, right here, and came over to the U.S. when I was 6 years old, in second grade. So I had already been in first grade, and I remember when I came over, I lived near a town near Corpus Christi, a little town called Taft, Texas, and when we came over, we moved in the summer, and so I hadn't started school, but I met my next door neighbor. And my next door neighbor must have been in first or second grade also. And we had a discussion over this hurricane fence. Like, he was on one side, I was on the other. And he wanted to know where I was from, and I told him, and he said, "Oh, you're Mexican." And he said, "You guys started the war." And I said, No, we didn't. You started the war." And so as a second grader, I was coming into second grade, I had already learned the Mexico's version of the war. And he had already learned the U.S. version of the war. And he was Mexican American, and I was gonna become Mexican American, right? I was Mexican, and I just find that fascinating. And since I grew up in this area, I have relatives on both sides, right? And the relatives on the Mexican side, they have this version of the U.S.-Mexican War that the relatives on the U.S. side, at least the ones who went to school on the U.S. side, learn a different version, the U.S. version of it. So I think it's just fascinating. I mean, it's another sort of use of public memory, and I think like the Brown Berets specifically, and Alina Zavala and some of these other activists, they're trying to correct that in their different ways. I mean, they're very different groups, and one of the reasons I chose those two images for the poster that Rebecca put together. One was of LULAC, these respectable middle class businessmen and doctors and teachers and so professionals basically on one side, and on the the Brown Berets after they took over Catalina Island, is because they're completely different groups. I mean, one's Chicano rights, very sort of confrontational, and LULAC are all about trying to obtain respect and appear white and so forth. And yet they refer to the war and they refer to the treaty and they use it, and I just find that fascinating.
I have
Yes.
a question.
Yes.
Could you talk about the Mexican collective memory with regards to Santana?
Oh.
That they see him as a traitor,
Uh-huh.
or even I've read that some people view him as selling half of the country to the Americans.
Sure. Well, I can only speak about it as a U.S. historian, and I'm not a historian of Mexico, and as someone who received part of their education in Mexico, first grade. But yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, right? But yeah, he's not well liked. Definitely not well liked in Mexico. I mean, he was a dictator, and he basically was in power several times. He began as a liberal, and then sort of left office and then became a sort of a conservative and came back to office, and that's when the U.S.-Mexican War occurs, and that's when actually the Texas Rebellion occurs as well, right? When he's in office as a conservative, and he's basically trying to centralize government and basically put more power in his hands, in the president's hand, and less power in the states. And several states, including Texas, but also in southern Mexico, rebel. So Texas isn't the only one that successfully rebels, but the other states join the nation, Mexican nation later on, whereas Texas doesn't. But yeah, no, he's not seen in a positive light by any means.
I guess what I'm hinting at is, was there some sort of reason why other politicians of that period decided to blame him for all that in order to cover up maybe what they're doing on the side, corruption?
Sure.
I know other people or Mexican politicians were selling land in Texas to Americans even before
Right.
what happened with the Santa Ana.
Right. No, that's true. I mean, I think it has to do with sort of his policies, his national policies that led Texas to rebel, and then the fact that, under duress, when he got captured in San Jacinto, in the Battle of San Jacinto, he signs the paperwork saying that, he's giving up, or Mexico, and as president, he's giving up the land, the Southwest.
Right.
So, since he signs it, there's this idea that he's the traitor, he's the one who's responsible.
Right.
But I mean, he was under duress.
Right.
He was captured. But yeah, I mean, I think he's an easy figure to blame. But you're right. I mean, there's other politicians that were very, very responsible as well. I mean, one of the things that happens between the time that Mexico achieves its independence in 1821 and the time in 1876 when Porfirio Diaz comes into office, that's a period of 55 years, okay? In that period, there are something like 70 changes of presidency in Mexico. So that's how unstable it was. Yeah. And several of those presidents were Santana. He kept coming back,
Right.
And so, it was incredibly unstable.
I guess kind of to finish off,
Sure.
What I also read is that Santana wasn't president when they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe.
Uh-huh.
That actually was a former Supreme Court Justice of Mexico called, was last name de la Peña y Peña, who authorized it. And many people blame him, Santana,
Right.
but it's not.
Well, because he was the military, he was the general in charge of the Mexican troops. But yeah, but oftentimes, like, what happened with him is that he wouldn't be officially the president, but he was really the one in charge. He was, he had sort of a puppet president.
Right.
So the same thing happened with Diaz, with Porfirio Diaz.
The Secretary of War, one of his puppets, I guess.
Yeah.
What was his name?
I don't remember.
Secretary of
Yeah.
War.
So, like I said, I'm not a Mexican historian, a historian of Mexico.
Right.
So, but thank you. Yes, and back again.
Yeah, and at the time of the war, there were anti-immigration laws in the Southwest against Americans, right?
At the time of the U.S.-Mexican War, yes and no. So what happened in Texas? I think you might be referring to what happened in Texas. So in Texas,
specific.
You know, the Mexican government, the Spanish government had initiated it when Mexico was still under Spanish rule, but then the Mexican national government continued it. They had this colonization program to try to encourage Americans and European immigrants to settle in Texas, because Mexicanos didn't want to go up there because it was isolated. It was really far from most capital cities, most major cities in Mexico. So like, students today will tell me they don't understand why would people not want to go to Texas or California, because they see California and they're like, why wouldn't anyone want to come here? Well, back then it was very different. It was very remote, very distant. They couldn't get supplies, they couldn't get manufactured items like kitchen implements and so forth. And so so Mexico did that, right? They encouraged Americans and Europeans, and the only thing they had to do to move to Texas to get permission is to say they were going to become Mexican citizens. And what happened in Texas is that some of them did. The empresarios, they were given land, and they were told by the Mexican government, we'll give you a contract to bring in 100 families or 50 families. And so Moses Austin, Stephen F. Austin's father,
Right.
He was one of these empresarios, right?
I was talking about California though specifically.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I heard that Jim Bridger, the famous mountain man, came down repeatedly and was arrested and imprisoned at Mission San Gabriel
For
illegally immigrating into.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. I mean, they were supposed to get permission from the Mexican government, and if they did get permission, historian David Weber has said
Right.
about the Americans moving into Texas illegally. They weren't asking for permission, saying those are really the first illegal aliens in Texas.
Right.
To try to make a point, right? Like, they didn't arrive legally. And what happens in Texas is that the Mexican government realizes that Anglo-Americans are completely overrunning the state of Texas, or the territory of Texas, by something like 7-1. They outnumber Mexicanos,
Right.
and so they stop the immigration, and that's what leads to them to revolt. That's one of the things that leads them to revolt. In addition to, the Mexican government outlaws slavery again in Texas.
I think John C. Fremont was another.
Right, in California, yeah. Yes.
I had a question in terms of the American GI Forum. Is it going to play a role or not?
Yes.
We're
No,
talking-
that's one group I didn't mention. Right, yeah, exactly. They're also going to be doing very similar things in the sense of when they're going to press for civil rights reform, specifically for military, veterans. They're also going to talk about the guarantees that the treaty had gave Mexican Americans. Part of the reason that all these groups refer to the war is because they refer to the treaty, because the treaty is the legal document that guarantees that Mexican Americans are legally entitled to full citizenship rights. And so when they're denied citizenship rights, which happens, sporadically, or not sporadically, but it happens throughout the U.S. Southwest, but differently in different areas, right? Then people are going to say, well, what about they'll mention to, state governors, to their representatives, and to the federal government, U.S. officials are going to say, what about the treaty? And so they keep going back to the treaty because they're saying, well, they're not asking for anything more. They're just saying, just respect what you signed, basically, and they're not. And so, people like Hector, Garcia, obviously, he's gonna be aware of that as well. I didn't mention him only because, I was mentioning so many groups, so I cut that group out. But that's another group that obviously I'm gonna discuss, because here are these veterans, right, who've served in the military. And yet when they come home, they're not treated as citizens. And there's several documentaries about this, and books written about they're denied burials in Texas because they're segregated cemeteries in Texas, and one military veteran who dies is denied, and so that leads to a lot of activism.
That was Longoria, right?
Right. Yeah, Felix Longoria.
Yeah, is he related to Eva?
You know, that's a good question because it's in that area. That's a good question. At some point they probably are, but I don't know how close. Yeah. But Eva Longoria is from the Corpus Christi area in general. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.